We spent the summer of 2006 in the UK. I remember we were spending the weekend with our home church. We were due to speak on the Sunday morning. And I woke up that morning with a phrase in my mind, outside the camp. It's a phrase from Hebrews chapter 13. Let us then go to him outside the camp, bearing the disgrace he bore. Now, I don't know that I've ever spoken on that verse before, but I spoke on it that morning. Outside the camp is, I guess, a metaphor of a place of filth. Refuse. It's where the lepers are confined. It's a place of punishment. It's a place of execution. It's a place of burial. I was challenged by Jesus speaking to his disciples and saying to them, follow me. Follow him where? Follow him where he's going. And the direction of Jesus' life, it seems, was to go outside the camp. He was called to outsiders, he was called to marginalised, and ultimately he was called to go outside the camp, outside the city gates, Hebrews says, to suffer and to be sacrificed, to die. The Message has a beautiful translation of it. It says, let us go outside where Jesus is, where the action is, not trying to be privileged insiders, but taking our share in the abuse of Jesus. And so I spoke on that passage. That we're not simply trying to be privileged. We're not called just to the insiders. We're called to the outsiders. We're called to the marginalised. We're called to take our share in the suffering of Jesus. It's interesting how sometimes in fact very often, you're challenged by the words that you say. You have to be careful what you say, I realise, so often. Anyway, we returned to South Africa where we were living, and I was immediately challenged by these verses. We'd had a long-term invitation to teach on a DTS, a discipleship training school, in our old town, Mary, back in Mozambique. And we were planning to go. We were going as a family of 3, and we were planning to go with 2 other friends. So there were 5 of us going. Now, we were fully aware of the distance. It's an 8,000 kilometre, and that's 5,000 miles round trip. With driving with a toddler, that's 5 days of travel each way. Costs probably £750 to £1,000 in fuel and accommodation en route and stuff. So it's a lengthy trip. Now I was under the assumption that there were maybe 15 to 20 students, and I heard at the very last minute that there were just 5 students on this school. Immediately I was struck by, man alive, that's a long way to drive for 5 people. Is it worth it? Is it worth it? Started thinking about this, we prayed about it as a couple, and as we prayed, we were both challenged by how much value did we place on these 5 people. Yes, it was a very long way to drive. Yes, it would cost a lot of money. Yes, the DTS was not in a position to offer us anything towards our travel expenses, so we were paying for the privilege to drive for 10 days to teach 5 people. Why on earth choose such a ludicrous calling? And yet, as we prayed, we really felt that God showed his love to us through Jesus. That Jesus came, he showed up, he personally paid the price. The incarnation is costly. Jesus, his life was his message. And as we prayed, we remembered the story that Jesus told of the old widow sweeping out her house to find the one lost coin, and then her rejoicing when she found the lost coin. And we were challenged by the picture that in one sense, not in a patronising sense, but in one sense, these 5 students were lost coins. They were marginalised. They were outside the normal stream of events. They were in a remote, isolated part of Mozambique. They were lost coins. Were we as a family willing to pay the price of sweeping, of searching, of reaching out to those lost coins? I was even more challenged when I learnt that 3 of the students were ex-street kids who'd grown up on the streets in Beira. They were marginalised. Was I willing to pay part of the price? And so we decided, yes, we had to go. And we went. And yes, it was a long way to drive. And yes, it was expensive. But it was an amazing time. It was an amazing trip. I had the privilege of speaking for those 5 days in our old house. I was standing in the kitchen that I had built, which was a wonderful thing. Standing, leaning on the kitchen counter that I had made out of a mahogany worktop and coconut palm sides, panelled cupboard, and I was leaning on my worktop, and the students were sitting in the lounge area of the room, and I was teaching them from my kitchen, and I was seeing something of the investment of our lives over previous years bearing fruit now in the lives of these students. I was speaking for the week on mission. I was speaking on God's heart for people, on the way God shows his love. And I recognised what better way is there of teaching than actually modelling something. It had cost us something, not a lot, but it had cost us something to be there. It was sacrificial. And there was something significant in that. Our lives are our message. What is the message that my life is saying? As I prepared to go, I took that story of the widow and the lost coins and I made it the centrepiece of the week of teaching. I drilled some holes in small coins and I took them with me on pieces of leather to give them to act as bracelets or bookmarks, however they wanted to use them, and I gave them to the students. And I built the teaching around this story of the lost coins. And I talked about them as individuals, that God loved them so much that just like the widow, he was willing to go out seeking and searching to save, to rescue, to bring back to himself those lost coins. They, as individuals, were God's treasured possession. I remember one day I was talking about Abraham and God blessing Abraham and blessing him so that his life would be a blessing to all the nations. Abraham was blessed to be a blessing. And trying to make this personal, I asked them, so let's apply this to our lives. How has God blessed us? How has God blessed you? How do you feel you can be a blessing to other people? I asked this question to the group. There was silence. It was as if I'd hit a brick wall. And as I probed deeper, and this actually became a long discussion with the students and then later with some of the other staff, as we probed, we recognised the fact that for these kids, these young adults, especially these street kids, they had no money. They had no background of wealth or possessions. And in their mind, if they had no money, they were not blessed. And I realised that the danger of heretical prosperity type teaching, where we see blessing as primarily materialistic. If we don't have material possessions, we're not blessed. That totally devalues the poor. I am blessed, and therefore I can be a blessing. And my blessing is in so many ways, and it's not just material possessions. And as I'm blessed, I can give. There was something of real significance in the students recognising ways they had been blessed, recognising ways God placed value on them. And I realised that even us driving that distance to speak and to be with them was a way of dignifying them. It was a way of giving them worth. It was a way of us saying to them, you're worth it. You're valuable. God loves you. We love you. We're willing to pay a small price, but we're willing to put our love into action. One day, and this was a highlight of the week, one day we went on a field trip. We drove an hour or so outside of Maramayo to a small, old, ruined Catholic mission called Chupanga. It's beside the banks of the Zambezi River, and there's a graveyard there. And buried in the graveyard is Mary Livingstone Moffat, the wife of the missionary explorer David Livingstone. She died there on the banks of the Zambezi back in 1863. At the time, David Livingstone was exploring the Zambezi Valley. He had this vision that the river was God's highway into the interior of Africa. It would open up the interior of Africa to commerce, to the kingdom of God, to the gospel. His vision drove him to explore, and as he explored, he encountered the evils of slavery. He called slavery the open sore on Africa. He was exposing this wherever he went. Mary Livingstone got sick with malaria, along with many other people in that expedition, and she died there at Chupanga and was buried in the graveyard. We went to her graveyard. Now, in the day before we went, we spent quite a bit of time processing what we were going to do the next day, because for these students, none of them had ever been in a graveyard unless it was for a funeral. They associated graveyards with witchcraft. It was a place of fear and anxiety. And so we talked about it. We processed what we were going to do. We went to her grave. We sat beside her grave. And it was fascinating, actually, to see the reaction of these Mozambican students as they sat beside the grave of a long-dead European woman from a different era who had come to Mozambique looking, essentially, for lost coins, looking to reach out to the people of Mozambique. The grave was in quite a bad state. It was covered in grass, it was covered in bushes. I remember one of the Mozambicans saying, "She was a hero. She should be remembered. Why is this grave not looked after?" And they started pulling out the weeds from around the grave and cleaning it up. Someone else, in reflection, said, "If she gave her life for the people of Mozambique, how much more should I be willing to give my life for my people?" We were separated by more than 150 years of history, and yet somehow we were joined to this hero of faith. There's something about being in a graveyard which is very sobering. I love taking groups into graveyards. I've done it in Heathcote at the Moravian graveyard. I've done it in Harpenden at the graveyard there. I've done it in many places. There's something about sitting in a graveyard with young people at the start of their life and recognising their own humanity, thinking about their mortality, thinking, what will my epitaph be? How will I be remembered? Recognising the sacrifice of people who've gone before them. It confronts you with your humanity. It's a humbling experience. And I saw that in these Mozambicans. I saw they were saying, we're valuable. People came from the outside with a heart to reach our nation. We have value. We have dignity. 10 years later, after Mary Livingstone's death, her husband David Livingstone died in Zambia. His body was buried there. His heart was taken out of his body and taken overland all the way back across Africa and then up to London, which was an epic voyage and a book in its own right. His heart was buried in Westminster Abbey. And there's a plaque there with an epitaph to him. It's a verse from John chapter 10 where Jesus said, "Other sheep I have which are not of this sheepfold, them also must I bring, and they will hear my voice." That verse encapsulated David Livingstone's yearning to reach the outsiders, to reach those outside the camp. It encapsulates Jesus' passion to go outside the camp, to make himself known to the least, the last, the lost, the marginalised. And as I stood by Mary Livingstone's grave with this group of young people, 3 of them kids who'd grown up on the streets of Beira in a life of challenging situations, I was deeply challenged. I was almost shamed by my lack of drive to come, the fact that I had to be really convicted to come up to Mozambique myself. I was really blessed that I had come, and I was challenged. There is a cost to pay in reaching outsiders, and our call is to go outside the camp. Our life is our message. Mary Livingstone's life was her message, and as you sit by her grave and meditate on people from the past who've paid the ultimate price, their lives still speak to us today if we're willing to listen.